Oh, hey, fancy meeting you here, I guess. G Bumpy 2000 here, back with some more of Slappy's Nightmare. Now, let's pick up where we left off. Chapter 12. My room, Georgia shrieked. No, my room. Down on the floor, Slappy opened his eyes. What is her problem, he wondered. She leaped out of bed, kicking him over onto his side without realizing it. My room! I don't believe it! Who did this? Her screams rang in Slappy's ears. He pulled himself up enough to see, and a silent gasp escaped his throat as the room came into focus. What a mess! What a horrible mess! The window curtains had been shredded, Slappy saw. Shredded and clipped off at the ends. The closet doors stood open. All of the clothing had been pulled out and tossed across the room. A purple stain spread over the carpet like a dark puddle. The stuffed bears were kicked under the bed. Books and magazines, open and torn, were strewn over the floor and over the foot of the bed. The walls! They were smeared with blue and yellow finger paint. Finger paint! Georgia shrieked as if reading Slappy's mind. Finger paint! And then a hoarse cry burst from her throat. Stella! Stella, how could you? The floor shook as Georgia thudded out of the room and hurtled across the hall to her sister's room. Stella, how could you? Stella! Slappy shook himself hard as if trying to shake away a bad dream. He shut his eyes and then opened them slowly. The room didn't change, stained and cluttered and torn and trashed. All my hard work wasted, Slappy sighed. He pulled himself to his feet. That bratty little sister, he hissed furiously, shaking his wooden fists. That bratty little brat! She had ruined all of his hard work, ruined his good deed. Now I'm back to a big fat zero, he muttered, cursing and pounding the side of the bed. Now I have to start all over again. He crept to the bedroom door. Maybe I'll turn Stella's head around so that she's permanently facing the wrong way. She'll be sorry, Slappy thought bitterly. She'll be sorry she ever messed with me. He shuffled across the hall and stopped beside Stella's room. He could see Georgia swinging her fists in the air, screaming at her sister, her eyes wild, her face bright red. Stella sat up in her bed, hands raised as if shielding herself from Georgia. Stella's purple cap was draped over a bedpost. Her red hair stuck out wildly around her pale face. I didn't do it, Stella wailed. Shut up and listen to me. I didn't do it. Liar, Georgia screamed furiously. Liar, liar, of course you did it. Pressed against the doorframe, Slappy watched them scream at each other. A sound made him turn and gaze down the hall. Oh! He uttered a gasp when he saw Mrs. Boonshoff storming towards Stella's room. She sees me standing here. I'm caught. Now what? Chapter 13. Slappy went limp, slumped onto the floor, his legs folding beneath his body. What on earth? Mrs. Boonshoff screamed, swinging her fists at her sides as she strode down the hall. She let out a startled cry as she tripped over Slappy. Hey! She picked up the dummy and tossed him out of the way. Then she burst into Stella's room. Break it up, both of you, not another word. It took her a long time to get both girls to calm down. Look at my room! Look at it, Georgia wailed. She grabbed her mother with both hands and pulled her across the hall to her room. How did he get over here, she wondered out loud, stepping over Slappy. Mrs. Boonshoff gasped and raised a hand to her forehead when she saw the horror of Georgia's room. It wasn't me, Stella chanted. Tears rolled down her face onto the front of her pajamas. I don't believe this, Mrs. Boonshoff murmured weakly, saying each word slowly and distinctly. It wasn't me, Stella shrieked. Why would I do this? Why? Because you're jealous of me all the time, Georgia shot back. Huh? Stella gasped. It's true, Georgia insisted, still red-faced. You're jealous because I have the bigger room, and because I have puppets and things, and because I get better grades, and I'm taller, and because I'm older, and because Because. Not true. You're the liar, Stella screamed. You messed up your own room to get me in trouble. And she threw herself onto her sister, wrestling her to the floor, growling and sobbing. Stop it, Mrs. Boonshoff hurried to pull them apart. You're both going to clean George's room, she declared. I don't care if it takes a week. She turned to Georgia. And you'd better call your friend Allison. You will not be going to her birthday party today. You'll be home cleaning. But, Georgia spurted, that's so unfair. Georgia stormed past her mother and crossed the hall to her room and slammed the door behind her. Mrs. Boonshoff hurried after her. Stella dropped onto the edge of her bed, breathing hard, her entire body trembling. Slappy watched her muttering angrily to herself, shaking her head, her red hair falling wetly over her face. I only have a week to do my good deeds, the dummy thought angrily. I can't have her ruining them for me. I have no choice. I have to let her know who's the boss around here. Slappy picked himself up off the floor. He straightened his sport jacket and shuffled quickly into Stella's room. Her eyes bulged in shock when she saw him walking up to her. But Slappy didn't give her a chance to cry out. He shoved his wooden hand hard against her mouth and brought his face close to hers. Hey, Stella, he rasped. The next time you ruin my good deed, I'm going to stick my hand so far down your throat, you'll have splinters in your stomach. Stella's eyes bulged even wider. She jerked her head away from Slappy's hand and let out a terrified scream. Slappy turned as Mrs. Boonshoff burst back into the room. He instantly went limp, sinking on Stella's bedspread. Stella, her mom cried. What's going on? What are you doing with George's dummy? It talked, Stella choked out. Mrs. Boonshoff frowned. Really? Yes, it talked, Stella insisted. Mom, listen to me. The dummy, it walked in here and it talked all by itself. Mrs. Boonshoff stomped across the room. She grabbed Slappy in both hands, turned him around, and stared angrily into his eyes. This time I'm caught, Slappy realized. I'll never get my good deeds done. I'm going to sleep forever. This time, I'm doomed. But I'm not going down alone. If I'm going to die, they're going to die first. All three of them. Chapter 14. Slappy gazed blankly up at Mrs. Boonshoff. She held him close for a moment, staring back at him. Then she turned to Stella. Stella, this lying has got to stop, she said softly. But, Mom, Stella tried to protest. Talking dummies, Mrs. Boonshoff cried, swinging Slappy under her arm. Talking dummies. Do you really expect any intelligent person to believe that? Stella opened her mouth, but no sound came out of it. I'm so worried about you, Stella, her mother continued, her voice breaking with emotion. I've warned you 1,000,000 times to stop making up stories. You were lying about George's room, too, weren't you? No, Stella gasped. No, Mom, really? Mrs. Boonshoff narrowed her eyes at her daughter. Denying it won't help, she said sternly. It's one story after another with you. You've got to believe me, Stella cried, glaring furiously at Slappy. Her mother sighed. Get cleaned up, Stella. Get dressed. Go help your sister put her room back together. Then you and I are going to have a long talk. Before Stella could protest again, Mrs. Boonshoff spun out of the room carrying Slappy under her arm. She brought him into George's room and tossed him onto the bed. Where did you find Slappy? Georgia asked. She was down on her knees on the floor trying to clean up the dark stain from her carpet. Stella claims he walked into her room and talked to her, Mrs. Boonshoff sighed. Georgia dropped her sponge and laughed. She's sick. Her mother bit her bottom lip. It isn't funny, Georgia. It isn't funny at all. The next morning, Georgia brought Slappy down to breakfast. After getting her room back together, she spent hours practicing with him. She thought maybe her mother would like to see some of the comedy act she was working on, but Mrs. Boonshoff had an appointment in town and was eager to get out of the house. Georgia plopped down at the breakfast table and placed Slappy on the chair beside her. I can't believe I'm missing Allison's party, she moaned. I'm sorry, her mother replied, pouring herself a mug of coffee. But we have to have rules around here. We can't have arguing and screaming and wrestling matches. It's just the three of us now since your father died. I know, Georgia stammered. So we have to stick together. We have to live peacefully with one another. What happened yesterday was a total disgrace. Yes, I know, Georgia repeated softly, but it wasn't my fault. Mrs. Boonshoff took a long sip from the white mug, keeping her eyes on Georgia. I thought of something nice you can do today to get back on my good side, she announced. Something you can do with that dummy. George's face brightened. Really? Like what? Well, I was talking to Mrs. Kramer last night. You know her daughter Maggie, right? Georgia nodded, chewing a mouthful of toast. Yeah, Maggie broke her leg. Not exactly, her mother replied. She's in a wheelchair. Poor thing. It was a really serious hip fracture. Georgia swallowed the toast and reached for the orange juice pitcher. So what do you want me to do? Mrs. Boonshoff set down her coffee mug and leaned across the table. I think it would be nice if you took Slappy over to Maggie's house and put on a little show for her. She's very lonely and depressed. It would really cheer her up. A smile spread over George's face. That's a great idea, Mom. I'll do it. She turned to Slappy. We can try out our new act, right, Slappy? Right, she made Slappy reply in the high Mickey Mouse voice. It is a great idea, Slappy thought. Better than they know. Maybe I won't have to kill them after all. Putting on this show will be my good deed, and this time, nothing's gonna ruin it. Good morning, Stella stepped into the kitchen dressed in white shorts and a bright magenta tank top. She already had her purple cap pulled down over her head. I'm going too, she announced. That'll be about enough for this time. Catch you next time, and I'll be reading the next few chapters of Slappy's Nightmare. Thanks for reading with me. Say bye-bye. They're sending me to Vietnam.